Thank you again. Yeah, so I hopefully don't have to convince you that especially extreme inequality can be negative for society. There's a lot of evidence that it has negative impacts on things like economic growth, health, the level of violence in a society, as well as things like societal cohesion, like trust, and also mental well-being. But probably most people don't think there should be absolutely zero inequality. So there's quite a lot of debate over what is a fair level of inequality. And of course, different people have different ideas about this. This is often debated. And some of the things that matter is, of course, whether inequality is viewed or attributed to things like merit, whether it's about hard work and people's talent, sort of internal factors, versus whether it's attributed to external factors like luck or your family background. So that's one factor that affects how fair people view it. May also depend on your own position in society. If you're better off, you may view that inequality as more fair than if you're worse off in society. And it may also depend on things like the narratives that you're exposed to in the media, or maybe the information that you seek out, and whether that information reinforces or challenges the views that you already have. And it may also depend on how extreme inequality is. People may be tolerant of some level of inequality and think that's fair, but when it gets to more extreme levels, maybe less so. And these last two factors are the ones that I'll explore in my talk in two projects, where we've looked at both the role of attention in reinforcing or combating self-serving fairness views, and also how people respond to more extreme levels of inequality and shifting levels of inequality. So in the first project, this was a project that I did with Joël van der Velde and Davide Pacha when I was a postdoc at the University of Amsterdam. And here we were really interested in whether attention relates to sort of self-serving ideas of fairness. So as I mentioned before, whether inequality is fair depends on whether it's attributed to merit, which is seen as more fair, versus luck. But we also see self-serving ideas that play into that. So people who are more socioeconomically advantaged tend to attribute their success to hard work more than to luck, and vice versa for those who are more disadvantaged. So they sort of view their own success as due to merit, and in that way can justify the inequality. We also have some causal evidence that changes in people's life circumstances due to luck can impact their fairness views. So Ditella et al. Found that squatters who randomly gained property rights became more libertarian in their views. They were more accepting of luck also playing a role in inequality than those who didn't. And also Fidberg has found that people who fall on harder times may shift to more egalitarian views. So they may think that actually there should be less inequality and more redistribution based on these life circumstances. We also see this in lab experiments, some self-serving ideas of fairness, where those who benefit from luck, either by being randomly assigned a higher pay rate or getting an easier task to complete, tend to keep a higher proportion of the earnings that they earn with someone else than if they didn't benefit from that luck. So people do still seem to take some advantage of this luck when they can. And what we were interested in, does attention play a role in this? Why should we care about attention? Well, it underlies the entire media industry. So there are many people competing for your attention all the time, right? News organizations and politicians, but also advertisements and social media. It's a huge, very profitable industry. So people are trying to to expose you to things that will capture your attention. And people may, of course, seek out information that justifies their beliefs or their position in society. And we look at that in a motivating survey that I'll talk about. And there's also some research that shows that even for the same information, people's ideology shapes the way that they perceive it. And that might be due to them paying attention to different things in the same scene. Another sort of note from the more cognitive science literature on attention is that manipulating attention can shift the choices that people make, but it's usually not going to drastically shift people's preferences. So it really only seems to be able to shift people's choices when it's close to their indifference point, when they are kind of in between two different choices, maybe not so confident about that choice. Then we see that shifting attention can have a role, but otherwise not so much. So if you have a very strong preference, no matter how much I make you look at something else, it's not going to change your preference. So what we're interested in here is, does this apply to sort of these fairness views? How malleable are they or not? So that kind of tells us something about whether attention will play a role or not. And of course, if it does play a role, then it might give us insight both into how people develop or maintain these fairness views, but also whether there are ways to align them better when there are big divides. So in our motivating survey, we looked at only high and low income participants, and we simply asked them, which of these 2 articles do you want to read? Note that they did actually have to read the articles, and we paid them for answering comprehension questions correctly. So they knew that they couldn't sort of just choose one and get out of it. And the 2 articles are Luck Looms Larger in Success Than Most of Us Think. So this article is really focusing on the role of luck in people's overall outcomes. Whereas the other article, Why High Earners Work Longer Hours, is focusing more maybe on the merit component, that people who earn more may actually also be working harder. And so, as you might imagine, what we find here is that the low income participants are more likely to choose to read about the role of luck in success, which may sort of give some justification to the fact that they have just fallen on bad luck. It's not really about hard work, their lack of success, whereas the high income are more likely to choose the article about why high earners work longer hours. Of course, this is not like a perfectly controlled experiment. There could be other reasons why they're choosing these 2 articles, but it gives us some hint that people are kind of seeking out information that aligns with a view that is more justifying of their position in society. So in our more controlled study, we're sort of taking from the previous literature that people's status, their level of advantage in society might affect the way that they allocate money. And what we're interested in going the next step is whether their status or their pay rate affects what information they pay attention to before making these decisions. And so are they looking purely at merit information, sort of how well do they perform on a task, or are they looking at sort of overall success, which is usually what we see in life, which is a combination of merit and luck and is often hard to disentangle. So in our lab study, we can make this more explicit. Now, even if we find that there is different attention, this could just be, again, due to justifying their position already. And so the next step in the second study, we look at if we causally manipulate attention, will that impact allocation decisions? So is it not just that people make different allocations and have different attention, but actually that attention could be one of the mechanisms by which these different allocations are being made? And then lastly, we were also interested in whether differences in attention and allocations that are developed when your own self-interest is at stake might influence also impartial decisions when you're deciding for other people. And so the reason that that is relevant or interesting for us is because people may develop these from their sort of history, their life experiences, but then as judges or policymakers who are making decisions for other people, are they able to sort of abstract from their own life experience and positions, or does that bleed over into these decisions? And so the way that we look at this is, first, we just have all participants complete tasks. So they're actually earning the money that they're splitting in this experiment. And then we have dictators and recipients. So it will be a dictator game where the recipients, after they've completed the tasks, are just sort of passive recipients, and the dictators continue on to make choices. I have 2 sample sizes here because we ran 2 studies. I'll talk more about that, but one where we just looked at free attention and one where we manipulated attention. To shift sort of the luck and the inequality between the pair, half of the dictators were randomly assigned to get a high pay rate per correct answer on these tasks that they did, and the other half were assigned to get a lower pay rate. The high pay rate was 3 times that of the low pay rate. So it was a substantial difference. And that's entirely due to luck. It's not due to anything about the task performance, and we make that very explicit to participants. Then the participants are matched, the dictators with recipients, always with the opposite pay rate. So there's always inequality between them in terms of the pay rate. And they decide how to split their joint earnings across 20 different rounds with different recipients. Also to note, the trials are balanced by task performance. So on about half the trials, the dictators performed better than the recipients and vice versa. So they're relatively matched, but we also control for that. And then right after they make all these self-relevant divisions, we have them make impartial decisions. So they're deciding for 2 recipients, always one high pay rate and one low pay rate, how they want to divide their joint earnings. And so here there's no self-interest at stake. It's just sort of what do they think is fair. And we always had those after the involved decisions because we wanted to see if there's sort of spillover in any biases that were developed there. We gave them a bonus based on one random allocation. So if it was from the involved decisions, then the dictator would get what they kept for themselves and the recipient would get what they were allocated. If it was from the impartial, both recipients got what was allocated by the dictator, and the dictator, we gave a small bonus of like 1. And then, of course, we at the end asked them about sort of their more explicit strategies and fairness views and things like that. And I'll also just note, if there are any questions in between, feel free to ask if anything is unclear. So just to give an idea of the sort of tasks they were doing, we had some that were more pure kind of effort-based. So this is just moving sliders to a position on the screen or counting the number of zeros in a matrix. And then some that were a bit more maybe talent or skill-based, like Raven's matrices, detecting patterns, and cognitive reflection and logic. We initially thought there might be differences in the way people perceived these. We didn't find any large differences or meaningful differences in behavior, so I will collapse across all the tasks and the results I present. And of course, we wanted to look at attention. And so I'll show you sort of what a trial looked like for one participant, so you can see how we did that. So on the first page of each round, they saw which task was underlying that division and how much money they had to, in total to divide between themselves and the recipient. So just the total joint earnings. On the next page after that, we have a mouse lab web setup. And so here, there are these 4 boxes with information. And when there's no mouse hovering over, then all the information is closed. Participants can't see any of it. So here we can see what they decide to reveal. And by hovering their mouse over a box, they can open it. And when they move their mouse out, then the box closes. And so this allows us to see which information people are interested in and for how long they're looking at it. So this is our measure of attention. And the 2 types of information they can look at are the number of correct answers on the task. And so this is just a measure of sort of pure merit. It's just how well did you each do on the task. And then we also have information about the monetary contribution. And this is more kind of this overall success outcome measure, which is a combination of both how well you performed on the task, but also your pay rate, which is either high if you're lucky or low if you're unlucky. So it's also incorporating this luck aspect, but it's mixing the 2. And so we can see which information people want to seek out. They have 6 seconds in total to look at information. And that's because also in real life, time is often scarce. People are often busy. And in the study, we wanted to make it so that participants could look at all information if they wanted to, but they didn't feel obligated to really explore it. And instead, they would prioritize what they thought was most relevant and look more at that. And 6 seconds seem to be plenty that you can look at all pieces of information. Most people actually did. Yeah. And then they just came to a slider where they can decide how much money to allocate to themselves and to the other participant. So that's the overall setup. As I mentioned, we have these 2 types of information. So we sort of collapse across the self and other, and we look at merit information, which is just correct answers, and then outcome information, which is this monetary contribution that's a mix of merit and luck. And then we had different attention treatments. So what I just showed you is the free focus, which is where participants could open any information for any length of time during that 6-second span. But we also wanted to manipulate attention. So in our manipulated attention treatments, we didn't want to force people to look at information because we thought they might react negatively to that. We also didn't want to have experimenter demand where people think they should look at certain information. So we still kept it that they could look at whichever information they wanted and open it in whatever order, but just that certain information was relatively more scarce. So certain information boxes would close and could not be reopened after 400 milliseconds, so about half a second. It's plenty of time from the attention literature to process the information, especially because these are relatively simple numbers, not super complex information, but you may not be able to go back to it multiple times. The other information boxes, participants could spend up to 1600 milliseconds looking at it. And we had two focus treatments, the merit focus treatment. So here, merit is relatively easier to access because outcome information has this shorter time that you can look at it on the majority of trials. And in the reverse, in the outcome focused treatment, we made merit information relatively more scarce because it had this shorter time limit, again, on the majority of trials. And for the other trials, the remaining 6, we split them up between restrictions on self, other, and the other type of information. And this was just to sort of obscure the manipulation a bit. So again, participants didn't necessarily pick up on it or think that we were trying to push them in one direction of what to look at. And indeed, when we asked them at the very end, did you notice certain boxes were closing faster than others? About 60% didn't notice anything. 20% did notice and could correctly report the one that was most often closed, the treatment they were in. And then the rest were either wrong or partially right or didn't specify. But our results, we've tested the robustness to those that don't notice. So it doesn't seem to be that any of the findings we have are about demand, but more just about how long you're looking at the information. Okay. So our hypotheses were, again, that we could confirm that those who are advantaged by a higher pay rate will keep more for themselves. This is sort of replicating previous work, but then also that the advantaged who benefit from this higher pay rate will look more at this overall outcome, success, monetary contribution information, where they benefit from having a higher pay rate, whereas those who are disadvantaged by a low pay rate would look just at the merit information, just task performance without the pay rate component before their decision. And then our causal attention hypothesis was that if we shift attention to look more at merit information relative to outcome information, that people will give less to the advantaged participants because it's then more just about how did you perform on the task, again, less about the role of luck. And then lastly, we hypothesized that in the impartial decisions, some of these patterns that we found of self-serving attention and allocations would bleed over into the impartial decisions. So first, we can look at what happens with the attention, depending on your position, your status. And what I'm plotting in terms of attention here is the amount of time you spent opening the boxes about the task performance, the merit information, minus the amount of time you spend on the outcome monetary contribution, which incorporates luck information. So 0 would mean you're looking evenly between the two types of information. 1 or positive values mean you look more at merit information, and negative means you look more at the overall monetary contribution, this overall outcome. What you can see is the disadvantaged in purple are looking relatively evenly between the two. And the advantaged are looking even more at the outcome information. So that incorporates this, for them, a higher pay rate and maybe justifies keeping more for themselves. So we do find a difference between them. It's significant and it's about 350 milliseconds. So it's not huge, but of course the time spans that they're looking at the information is also not very big. It's maximum 6 seconds. Then for our treatment or our focus manipulations, here it's really just a manipulation check. Were we able to shift attention or not with this manipulation? And indeed we were. So you can see in the merit focused treatment, participants look about half a second longer at merit information relative to outcome and vice versa in the outcome. So we're able to shift attention by about 1 second between the two treatments. If we look at the impartial decision, so that was all making decisions for yourself, what we see is there is still somewhat of a difference between the advantaged and the disadvantaged. So the disadvantaged are still looking relatively more at merit, and the advantaged relatively more at outcome, or in this case, more evenly. But you can see that error bars get quite a bit wider. This is much noisier, and depending on the specification, it's not always significant. So it does seem like maybe they just don't care as much and are just noisier in their attention when they're making decisions for someone else. So yeah, some evidence that it persists, but it's not very strong. We do see, again, that there's still a difference between the merit and the outcome-focused treatments in what's being looked at. But also, if I go back and forth, you can see that for all of them, there's sort of this level shift up. So regardless of the treatment, we find that they're all looking relatively more at merit when they're making impartial choices. This wasn't something we pre-registered as opposed to the other hypotheses, but it is sort of interesting in how striking it is that they all move up. And it suggests that maybe when people are deciding for others, there's no self-interest at stake. They actually think that merit information is the more fair information to look at. This levels shift suggests that. So there may be some tension between sort of the more self-interested strategy and what you think when you're making these impartial choices. So that's what we find for the attention aspect. And now we can look at what we find in terms of actual behavior of how they're dividing money. So what we see in the free focus treatment, so where they're allowed to look wherever they want, is that the disadvantaged are giving around 50% of the pie to the advantaged and then keeping about 50% for themselves. So they're splitting relatively evenly. Because of the way we constructed the trials, what this hides a bit is that they might be dividing according to merit, but it evens out to 50-50. With the advantaged, they're giving about 60-some% to the advantaged or to themselves. So they're keeping much more for themselves than the disadvantaged are due to this lucky high pay rate. So this just sort of replicates previous work and confirms that there is this self-serving bias. And then what we really were curious about is when we've shifted attention, we've shown that we did successfully shift it, does this shift allocations? So how sensitive are these behavioral measures to this manipulation of attention? And there what we find is that there is a significant shift between the merit-focused treatment and the outcome-focused treatment in how much is given to the advantaged. It's about 3 percentage points, so this is a smaller difference, but there is less in the merit-focused treatment given to the advantaged. So that does go along with the idea that if you're focusing only on task performance and ignoring luck, that the advantage should sort of get less based on that. What you can also see is that there's not much difference here between the disadvantaged. They're giving slightly less than 50% here to the advantaged across both treatments. And the change is really driven by the advantaged participants. So when they're pushed to look more at merit, they're keeping less for themselves. When they're pushed to look even more at the outcome monetary contribution information, they're keeping even more for themselves. And that suggests that they might be more malleable in their fairness views, perhaps because they realize that using this luck component may or may not be fair. They might be somewhat conflicted about that. So when they can focus on it, they use it, but when they're pushed to focus less on it, they're using it less. But that's, of course, an interpretation of it. Now, if we look at the impartial decisions when they're deciding for another participant, what we find is that the advantaged are still giving more to the advantaged, but this gap is much smaller. So it's about 3.5 percentage points more in these impartial choices. And we also now don't find a difference between the merit and the outcome-focused treatment. There's just a lot less room to move around there. So in that sense, some of this advantage bias does seem to be bleeding over, but the attention manipulation is no longer having an effect. And to sort of put this all together in one figure, on the x-axis here, I have the shift in attention. So on the right side are those who are looking much more at merit information. On the left side, those who look much more at outcome information. and then on the y-axis, the percent given to the advantaged. And the lines, the shaded lines, are really showing just individual differences in behavior. So you can see that both the advantaged and disadvantaged that look much more at merit are giving less to the advantaged. And those that look much more at outcome, that incorporates the pay rate, end up giving much more to the advantaged. Nevertheless, there's still a gap. So even for the same attention between the two groups, there is still this gap where the advantaged are giving more to themselves. And so there are likely some other mechanisms also at play. Attention matters, but it's not the only thing. And then these symbols that you can see on top are plotting the averages for treatments. So you can see the amount at which we're shifting attention across to the left and the right. And what you can also see is for the advantaged, the shift in allocations is also going along with this shift in attention. So they're sort of looking similar to those that just have individual differences along with that shift in preference. And for the disadvantaged, they're not shifting their allocations accordingly, as I showed in the previous figure. So again, the advantaged seem to be much more malleable in their fairness views. The disadvantaged have individual differences, but shifting their attention is not changing those as much. So again, to wrap up on this one, the advantaged participants are looking less at merit information than the disadvantaged. They're also keeping more for themselves. But when we push them to look more at merit information, then they keep less than when we push them to look even more at the outcome information. And this is mostly just the advantaged participants who are shifting. But as I mentioned, this doesn't account for the entire bias. So things like beliefs about performance and other fairness views may also play a role. And we have another study on that I will not talk about today, but I'm happy to answer any questions about it if there are. So this is the first study that I'll talk about. I wanted to pause in case there are any questions, maybe before I move to the next study.
Hi, Diana. That was fascinating. If I could just make maybe a comment, because it's interesting because what you seem to be doing here is sort of making people aware of the injustice as opposed to whether, or rather shifting the dial on what constitutes merit. And I was wondering what you thought about is this, if you apply it to the real world, where if you think about taxes and redistribution, the outcome is almost conflated with merit because the people who put more in are the ones who are sort of the higher income ones who have had the advantages are also giving more into tax pools. So I wonder how you think this kind of applies to that sort of questions about tax redistribution.
Yeah, so I think there the question is about how much people think that higher earners earn their money purely through merit. And often in society, of course, it's hard to disentangle the exact, how much is due to hard work and how much is due to external circumstances, like having better opportunities from your family or other random luck that comes into play. And so I think that is often the difficult part, is that there may be misconceptions about the role of each of these things that comes into it. So yeah, I think it's not inherently that higher taxes are, I don't know, should be meritocratic or not. It's sort of about whether you support redistribution depends on how fair you think those inequalities of incomes are in the first place. I'm not sure if that fully answered. But.
Yeah, no, it's a difficult one, but thanks. I just want to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, so I think a lot of it is in society, these things are just so so entangled, it's very hard not to tell. So here we try to split them apart. Of course, you can still say that even our measure of merit can be due to things like talent, which you don't necessarily have control of, or that even things like self-control or hard work may also be somewhat not something you have full control of. So I think that is also something that is completely up for debate, and whether those can be fully disentangled.
Yeah, good point. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions before I move to the next? Okay, and I will continue. So in this second study, this is work in progress. So some of the results are from the last week or two, so it's quite preliminary. But this is work with Rafaela Pinto, who was a former master's student when I was at the University of Amsterdam, and Oda Sund, who is also a postdoc at the University of Amsterdam, but we're still working on the project. So here we're really interested in how the level of inequality matters and how people react to that. And one sort of inspiration, motivation for this is all of the debates about inequality between CO pay and their workers, and debates about whether there should be a cap on how much COs are made relative to their workers. And in the case of COs, you might argue that there are sort of reasons, given the different job that they have than workers, that they should be paid more, but there's some level at which people seem to react to it being too much, even if you accept some level. And if we look at the trends, for example, in the US, at top companies, in the 70s, CEOs were making around 20 times as much as their workers, and now it's more like 300 times as much as their workers. And it's unclear whether, the job has changed so much as to justify that. So in our study, what we're interested in is a bit more, even when there's no justification for it, if inequality becomes more and more extreme, how will people react? And at some point, is it too extreme to sort of keep justifying? The context for this, as I mentioned before, is inequality is associated with conflict and instability, but still demand for redistribution is often lower than expected. There are a lot of reasons for this. And as I mentioned in the question, there's a lot of misperceptions, often about the actual level of inequality and also about the underlying source, because these are just very hard to disentangle in the real world. So that's why, again, we're looking at this lab study where we can make merit and luck much more explicit to see how people perceive it when it's much more explicit. And then hopefully that can at some point translate and be complicated into these more real world scenarios where there are also misperceptions and it's harder to disentangle. So our overarching research question was, how does inequality in pay ratios do very explicitly to luck in our setting impact these self-serving biases in allocations? In one of the studies, we also looked at attention, but I won't have time to get into it here. And we had sort of a side exploratory question of whether it matters whether inequality is increasing or decreasing, because often in the news we hear about, the top 1% gaining more and more wealth. And so does it matter if sort of the overall level, or does it matter whether it's going up or down? And we had two thoughts. One is just, as we found in the previous studies, those who randomly, due to luck, get a higher pay ratio will just use it as an excuse to keep more. And even if it's more extreme, people will just still use it as an excuse to keep even more. But we also thought maybe if it gets high enough, then it becomes sort of very obvious that it is unfair, and that might undermine excuses for keeping more. So we weren't sure kind of which direction it might go. The setup was very similar to the previous study. So again, everyone was completing tasks on the first day, and then the dictators continued. They were randomly assigned to be advantaged or disadvantaged with a high or low pay rate. And then they also, again, made allocations of their joint earnings between themselves and a recipient. Here it was 30 decisions. And what was different is that we had different pay ratios. So in the previous study, the advantaged always made 3 times as much as the disadvantaged per correct answer. And here we also looked at what if they make 7 times as much per correct answer or 15 times as much per correct answer? How do they respond to that? Just to note, we kept the sum of the pay rates constant. So the size of the pie is relatively similar across the different pay rates. So it's not that at a 15 times pay rate, you have a way bigger pie, because that was not what we were interested in. And the other thing we varied was whether the pay ratios were increasing or decreasing across the trials. So they were always presented in blocks of 10 for a given pay ratio. And it either could start out that the advantage made 3 times as much, 7 times as much, and then 15, or it started high at 15 and then went down. And then, of course, we also incentivized it. So in study 1, all of one random trial was chosen to be paid out for the dictators and recipients. In study 2, 1/4 of the dictators had one trial paid out. And again, we asked them about their fairness views, and in study 2, also about their emotions and things like that at the very end. Okay, and then again, the main difference here is that before every set of 10 rounds, we told them what the pay ratio was. So we told them the high reward is 15 times the low reward per correct answer. And also on the first sort of round, we would tell them what the pay rates were. So in the other study, we did tell them the advantaged make 3 times as much as the disadvantaged per correct answer, but we told them once at the beginning, whereas here, every round, this was emphasized. So it was much more explicit what this differential was. In study 1, it was essentially the same as the previous study that you saw. In study 2, we didn't measure attention, just to make it a bit simpler for ourselves and participants. So they just had all the information boxes open on the screen, and they had to look at it for at least a few seconds, but then they could move on. And similarly, they just make an allocation on the slider. All the results I'll show, the figures are based on just raw data, but the significance is based on regressions where we control for demographics as well. So here, our hypotheses were that the advantaged who benefit from the higher pay rate will keep more for themselves, as we found in other studies and previous studies have found, but also that they would keep more at higher pay ratios, so that they would keep using this as more and more of an excuse to keep more, and that they would be less responsive to task performance or merit overall. Hypothesis 2 was something that we exploratorily found in study 1, and then we wanted to test whether it would replicate in our second study. And this is about whether inequality is going up or going down over the course of the trials. And so what we found in study 1 and hypothesized in study 2 is that the disadvantaged under increasing inequality, so when it's going up compared to when it's going down, would keep more for themselves, more at higher pay and more at higher pay ratios. So this is what we found in the first study, and we thought maybe it had to do with them when inequality is getting worse, they're kind of reacting more and more negatively to the unfairness. And so we thought they might also be more angry, and that might be explaining this difference we found. So we measured anger in study 2 also to see if that might play a role. And then hypothesis 3 is also something we found more exploratorily in study 1 and then pre-registered in study 2, which was that aside from sort of the level of inequality or the direction, those who performed worse than the recipient on the very first trial seemed to use merit information less across all of the trials. So this early signal about whether you performed better or worse than someone else seemed to affect just how much you think this information is relevant to your decision overall. So we want to see if that held up. Okay. So here what I'm plotting is the share of the pie kept by the dictator for themselves. The orange, again, is advantaged, the purple is disadvantaged, and then split by the different pay ratios of 3, 7, and 15 across both studies. What you can see, again, as sort of a manipulation check, the advantaged are keeping more than the disadvantaged for themselves. This is significant and very robust across both studies. We also find that the advantaged are keeping more at higher pay ratios. So it's a bit maybe small on the screen, but they are actually increasing, especially when we control for all the other factors, how much they keep. So they're keeping more when the pay rate is 15 times as much as the disadvantaged than when it's only 3 times as much. It's not fully in proportion. If it were, they would be keeping more like 90% at the pay ratio of 15, but they are using as an excuse to keep more and more. It never sort of gets to a point where it's so extreme that it backfires and they stop using it. Now we can look at how much they adhere to merit. So this is what I didn't really show in the other study, but is also the case that you don't really see in these collapsed averages, which is that they all do kind of care about task performance. So here on the x-axis, I'm plotting the share of merit. So this is your relative performance compared to the other participant versus the total. So if you both performed the same, then you're at 50%. If of the total performance that you both had, you had 75% of it, of the correct answers total, then you're at 75 here. And the straight line would be if you're adhering entirely to merit, if you're just dividing according to task performance. And of course, you can see none are fully adhering to that, but the advantaged in orange are keeping even more for themselves at these lower values where they did not perform as well as the recipient that they're matched with. And we find this across both studies. There's some noise sort of at the extremes. There aren't many trials there, but you can see that across the board, the advantaged are using this merit information a bit less. They still care about it. They still seem to be using it, but just a bit less than the disadvantaged. Then we're interested in, right, does the direction of inequality, whether it's going up or down over time, does that matter? And in study 1, we found differences where the disadvantaged in increasing inequality, you can see kept a bit more for themselves. So the level just went up, and they also kept a bit more at higher pay ratios. So we wanted to see if that happens in study 2. You can probably already see that we don't find a difference in the overall level between decreasing and increasing inequality. So that did not replicate. We also find sort of mixed evidence for whether the disadvantaged in increasing inequality keep more at higher pay ratios. So we saw that in study 1. In study 2, it's flatter, but because the group in decreasing inequality, the disadvantaged are actually decreasing how much they keep, this interaction is significant and positive, but it has a bit of a different interpretation here. It's more of a leveling off than an actual increasing. So I wouldn't want to make any strong claims about whether this is robust or not, or whether it really has the same meaning here. So we don't really seem to find that the direction matters that much in our replication. So yeah, it may have just been a few participants that shifted things strangely in the first. Given that lack of shift, you might not be surprised that we also don't find differences in the level of anger or emotion expressed between increasing inequality and decreasing inequality. And so if we look, we can see, of course, there are quite big differences between the advantaged and the disadvantaged. So the disadvantaged are angrier about the disparities in pay than the advantaged. They're also less guilty and less happy about it. So there are differences between the two groups, but not in terms of the direction of inequality. What we do find more exploratorily is that the disadvantaged, regardless of which increasing or decreasing inequality, those who rate their anger as higher over these pay disparities do tend to keep more for themselves. So there may be some reactance going on by some participants, but it doesn't have to do with the direction of inequality. And then lastly, looking at this other sort of bias that we see where the first trial, whether you perform better or worse than the recipient, seems to affect how much you adhere to merit. So here again, we're just plotting the share of merit versus the share of the pie kept. And then we've split it by whether you performed better than the recipient on the very first trial versus worse than the recipient. And what we find is across both studies, quite robustly, even though it's a small effect, those who perform worse than the recipient from the first trial tend to use this merit information a bit less. So you can see, for example, in study 2 at the lower end, they end up keeping a bit more for themselves. In study 1, it's a bit more mixed. They may actually keep less for themselves at higher levels. But yeah, this is raw data that's not controlling for everything else. So it's just a way to sort of try to visualize what's going on. So what I've shown here is that with these different pay ratios, the advantaged will use luck in the form of these higher pay rates to keep more for themselves, and even more at these higher pay ratios, even when they're making 15 times as much and they know it's entirely due to luck. For the inequality direction, it's not clear that there are robust differences depending on whether inequality is increasing or decreasing. There may be some effect that the disadvantaged in increasing inequality are reacting differently to the pay ratios, but I don't want to say anything super strong about it because it's a bit, the interpretation is slightly different across the two studies. And then lastly, we do find quite robustly that this initial performance on the task relative to the recipient from the first trial affects how people use this merit information across the whole study. So that's everything for these two studies. I want to thank you a lot for your attention, and I'm of course happy to discuss and answer any questions that you have.